This is the third video in my series on Alexander Pope. We'll be talking about 3 poems in this video. We'll start with an epistle to a lady, also titled Of the Characters of Women, published in 1735. So this was the last of the 4 so-called moral essays. The epistle to Richard Boyle was the first one. And it's the only one of the 4 addressed to a woman, Pope's close friend Martha Blount, whom he had met as a teenager after his family moved to Benfield. By the time they were in their 20s, they were rumored to be romantically intimate, which Pope always vehemently denied. Perhaps one reason why the title of the poem does not mention her by name, whereas the other moral epistles do. And when he died, he willed a substantial portion of his estate to her. So the most important woman in his life. It is worth reading this poem, so disparaging of women, particularly in the first third or so, in dialogue with Clarissa's speech in The Rape of the Lock, and in contrast to Eloisa d'Abelard, in which Pope adopts the persona of a passionate woman pushing against patriarchal social conventions. And that's something we can talk more about in class, certainly. Here are some other questions to think about as you're reading this poem. What does Pope dislike about women? What are their flaws? What does he say about women's education and its role in shaping women's character? And finally, what are the qualities of Pope's ideal woman? Martha Blount is his ideal woman. So what are the qualities that he recommends for women? Next is the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, also published in 1735. Arbuthnot was kind of a Renaissance man. He was a mathematician, he was a court physician during Queen Anne's reign, and a very close friend of Pope, of course. As a scriblarian, he was a member of the Scriblerus Club that also included Jonathan Swift. He published satires against political opponents, rival physicians, and London apothecaries opposed to government regulation. He nursed Pope's friend Martha Blount through a serious illness in 1732, and when his own health declined in 1734, Pope rushed this poem, an epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, to press just 2 months before he died in 1735. This satire is a highly personal one, provoked by Lady Wortley Montagu's vicious attack on Pope in her poem Verses Addressed to the Imitator of Horace, which we'll read later. That was published in 1733. And that poem was itself retaliation for Pope's portrayal of her in one of his imitations of Horace, the first satire of the second book of Horace, where she is explicitly targeted. Montague not only denigrates his poetic abilities, but also cruelly mocks his physical deformity, describing him as an angry little monster at one point and much worse. As we've seen, Pope hit back in his epistle to a lady, published the same year as the Dr. Arbuthnot epistle, and he would attack Wortley Montagu again in the Dunciad. The Epistle to Arbuthnot is the most autobiographical of Pope's major poems. In the last few verse paragraphs, for example, he tempers his satire with a defense of his family ancestry. Montagu had insulted his quote-unquote birth obscure, as well as the character and morality of his father. He speaks tenderly here of his mother's final illness and death. She died in 1733 while in the care of Arbuthnot, and also of Arbuthnot himself, whose fate was yet uncertain at the time Pope wrote this poem. And I provide a quote there from the poem. On cares like these, if length of days attend, may heaven, to bless those days, preserve my friend. Preserve him social, cheerful, and serene, and just as rich as when he served a queen. Whether that blessing be denied or given, thus far was right, the rest belongs to heaven. The bulk of the poem, however, consists of Pope's defense of his own character and role as a satirist, and witty barbs directed towards inferior writers, the dunces, as well as anyone who had insulted him personally or done some perceived injury to his career. So that leads me to my first question for you is who receives Pope's sharpest jabs in the poem? And what does he reveal about himself? And what does he want us to see? The Dunciad is a horrible caricature of Pope. There are different versions of this. In one of them, he's wearing a papal tiara, but he looks like a rodent, maybe, or a monkey. Hard to say. He looks more like a rat, I think. But this was a very popular caricature of Pope at the time and just shows the kind of vitriol that could be directed against him. Like The Rape of the Lock, the Dunciad is a mock epic in 4 books. And like the earlier poem, Pope would publish multiple versions with substantial emendations and revisions over the years. Our text presents the first book of the last version from 1743, which was a year before Pope died. The Dunciad first appeared in 3 books in 1728. It was at least partly instigated by Louis Theobald's public criticism of Pope's edition of Shakespeare. And Theobald, called Tybalt in the text, would hold the title of King of the Dunces until 1743. In the last version, Tybalt is replaced. We'll talk more about that in just a second. 1 year after the 1728 edition, in 1729, Pope published the Dunciad Variorum, which included some revisions and a substantial addition to the conclusion of Book 3 that prophesies a British cultural apocalypse under Hanoverian rule. Pope saw King George and Queen Caroline, Queen Anne's successors, as inimical to learning and the arts. And this edition also included, for the first time, a very cumbersome prose apparatus of satirical footnotes and commentaries, all kinds of lengthy appendices, prefaces that overwhelm the text of the poem. I'll give you a screenshot of a couple of pages from this Variorum edition, and the poetry just takes up a couple lines at the top of the page. This is very typical. And then the rest of the page is devoted to these lengthy prose notes, full of satire. In 1742, so 13 years after the Variorum edition, Pope published a 4th book under the title The New Dunciad, which he presented as a kind of sequel to show the fulfillment of the apocalypse prophesied at the end of Book 3, predicting the apocalypse, or the collapse, of British social and cultural institutions under the weight of dullness. A year later, in 1743, he combined all 4 books for the first time into a single work called The Dunciad in 4 Books, with further revisions to the first 3 books, the most noteworthy being the replacement of Theobald as King of Dunces. Theobald would die a year after this, in 1744, same year as Pope, and the elevation of the actor, dramatist, and poetaster Colley Cibber, who had exchanged some jabs with Pope in 1742. Cibber was very well known at this time as a poet. He was the poet laureate, in fact. He had succeeded another man named Lawrence Eusden in that role, and this required him, and poet laureates, he was required to write puff pieces for the court of George II, and Pope absolutely destroys him in the 4-book Dunciad. And there's a picture of Cibber. So it might be helpful to get just a general overview of the story of the Dunciad in its entirety. So Book 1, as you know, concludes with Cibber's coronation as king of the dunces and the goddess Dullness's proclamation that he will extend her soporific influence throughout the kingdom. Book 2 then picks up with a sequence of mock heroic games to celebrate this event, involving publishers, writers, and critics, all of whom, of course, are enemies of Pope. The hack publisher Edmund Curll wins a scatological foot race and a pissing contest. There's a noise-making contest won by the poet Richard Blackmore, a diving contest in Fleet Ditch, this was the main sewer of London, won by Jonathan Smedley, and a contest to judge the intellectual merits of 2 prominent dunces, which no one wins because everyone falls asleep before a verdict can be reached. Book 3 describes Cibber's descent to the underworld. where the shade of another well-known hack poet, Elkanah Settle, reviews the history of dullness's victories over reason from ancient times to the present day, and concludes with a dark prediction of her total conquest. Thy hand, great dullness, lets the curtain fall, and universal darkness covers all. Book 4 presents the total victory of dullness over the intellectual virtues, who lie about her bound in chains. She summons her loyalists to her throne room and rewards them for their devotion, then swallows up the world in an apocalyptic yawn. And Cibber lies sleeping in her lap through all of this. Some questions for you to consider as you read the first book of the 1743 version of the Dunciad. What seems remarkable in Pope's portrayal of the poem's heroes, Cibber, the goddess dullness, and the dunces? And what are some of the causes and effects of intellectual impairment, and what are the qualities of bad writing? And that concludes the third installment of my presentation on Pope. We will be looking at Lady Mary Wortley Montagu next.